So as Tim said, I'm Kathy. I'm going to be talking about the EPA's proposed revisions to the emission reporting regulations. So we'll start out with what is the current AERR. And it is an EPA regulation that requires states, local agencies, and tribes to report annual emissions to EPA. The current regulation allows for voluntary reporting of air toxics emissions, or HAPs, as they're also called, but it does require reporting of criteria and precursor pollutants. They use this data that they collect for several reasons, but mainly for the National Emissions Inventory. And if you're not familiar with the National Emissions Inventory, it is an EPA program that supports several different activities. It supports modeling for the regional area to see if companies or if areas are in compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. It helps drive regulations. It also lets you see trends, so you can see trends over time through the various regions and see what the emissions are. And as Vicki said, as they put tighter and tighter regulations and those emissions are reduced, the trend should show that they're going down. It's also good information for public information. So if people want to know the area where they live, what are the emissions and what are the rates, they can use this National Emissions Inventory as a tool to see what their emissions are. Also, a lot of university research bases their information on the data that's included in the inventory. So what the AERR requires is facilities to report, or for the states to provide information to EPA on the different facilities and factories that they have within their state. So it's going to require facility information, so the name of the facility, the address, the location, the type of industry, the SIC code, your NIAX codes, that type of information. And then it gets more detailed. So it'll go into a process. So let's say you've got like a utility. So you've got boilers, you've got turbines, or if you've got a foundry, you've got your melting furnaces, your pouring and cooling lines. It's going to ask you that information. It's going to ask you your design capacities. So what are those different processes or emission units that you have? What are their design capacities? It's further going to get into what are the types of processes. If you have a boiler, it's going to get to the process level as far as, do you have natural gas? Do you have fuel oil combustion? Are you burning coal? Are you using coke in your process? It gets into the very detailed information. It will also, the states have to provide the control equipment descriptions. Well, what type of controls do you have at your facility and on what processes? What are the efficiencies of those controls? And then finally, it's going to it's going to report what the emissions are, and it's going to show where the release point is. So in their database, it's going to say, is it coming out of a stack? Is it a fugitive emission? What's the velocity that it's coming out? What's the temperature? And then sometimes it asks for the geographic coordinates. Typically, that's more at the facility level. So it will ask you for the lat long of your facility. Again, the current rule requires reporting of the criteria air pollutants, NOx, PM, SO2, and it also is going to require the precursors. And I guess NOx and VOC would be precursors for ozone. Ammonia is going to be a precursor for particulate. And then certain emissions are considered point sources. And at the facilities, those are required to be reported as emission releases within the facility. So the proposed AERR updates. So EPA published the proposed rule on August 9th. It was when it went into the Federal Register. They're actually allowing a 70-day comment period, so it's going to go out until October 18th, 2023. When the rule first got published, I had started having conversations with IDEM, with the state agency. The main point of contact at IDEM has been there almost 25, 30 years. So I've known him for a long time, and he and I have been going back with implications that he sees and issues that he thinks are going to be a big problem. There's a lot of questions on who's going to end up having to report under this rule, and it's going to bring a lot of small businesses in that didn't have to previously report. EPA's objectives for the proposal is for them to make sure they have enough information. Right now, they've got criteria, air pollutants, and precursors. What this rule is going to also require is mandatory reporting of HAPs. That's a big deal, especially for smaller businesses that don't currently maybe not even track the HAPs or the hazardous air pollutants, but then they may get pulled into reporting. They also are using this rule to ensure communities have the data that they use so they can do their planning and make sure that if there's underprivileged areas that could be impacted, that they account for those. I'll get into more detail about it, but some of the proposed rules, the list of hazardous air pollutants, the thresholds, some of them are in the hundreds of pounds, triggers reporting. So it's going to bring in, when I talked to IDEM, he said it potentially could affect another 1,300 or 1,400 facilities within Indiana. So it's a pretty significant rule that's going through. So there's 9 major parts to the changes that are being made to the rule. All of these are going to affect owners and operators, but for all reporters, it's going to make changes and additions and clarifications to point source reporting. It's going to include new data about small generating units. Also, it's going to clarify that the data submitted are emissions data and not entitled to confidential treatment. I think I've got another slide later that gets into more detail about it, but essentially right now, emissions data, which is the actual air emissions, is considered the confidential data. The other information as far as where is that data released, what stack, what part of your process, that can be maintained as confidential information. What are your production throughputs? Some of those pieces of information that you use to obtain or calculate your emissions can be considered confidential. Under this rule, anything that you're submitting to the agency is not going to be considered confidential. For owners and operators, it's going to require the annual reporting of HAP emissions. Right now, that's a voluntary requirement, except for lead, that's required. But as far as the other HAPs, if you're a major Title V source, you're going to have to include all of your HAP emissions. If you're a smaller source that gets pulled into the reporting because your HAP emissions are above a certain threshold, you'll have to report those, and you will also have to report any criteria pollutants that may be associated. The rule is also going to require all the reporting to be submitted electronically and through what's called the Combined Air Emissions Reporting Tool. So it's just another EPA tool that you're going to have to submit all the data into. I know one of the highlights EPA pointed out was that by reporting HAPs and reporting all this information through this rule, it's going to get you a jump up and a head start on doing your TRI reports. So that was a big benefit. For states, locals, and tribes that are going to have to be changing what they're doing in reporting, there's going to be an option for the states to report on behalf of the agents or the owners and operators. It's also going to have a requirement to report any kind of prescribed burning through this tool. And then they're also making some additions and changes to non-point sources and mobile sources. The mobile sources is another thing that's going to affect owners and operators. Right now, under the Clean Air Act reporting or permitting, mobile sources don't get included with your Title V permits or your air permits. Mobile sources are excluded and regulated under other requirements. Under this rule, mobile sources that are tied to your facility will also have to be included. So it would include forklifts, it could include dump trucks, and any of your fleet vehicles that stay on property, all of that would have to be included. So right now what happens is people that have to report under the air regulations, they report directly to the states, locals, and tribes. And then the state then takes that information and reports it to EPA. Right now it's optional for owners and operators to report their HAP emissions. And when they do that currently, they're reporting it to the state if they choose to report that. And again, it's going to be an option for states right now to report this HAP emissions to EPA. Under the new regulation, or what's the proposed rule, and again, it's a proposed rule, so they are accepting comments. I know some industry groups are going to be providing comments. Specifically, I know the American Foundry Society provided comments and concerns before the rule ever went published into the Federal Register, so I'm sure they're going to follow up and comment again. It's my understanding with my discussions with the state that Indiana will likely comment on the rule. I've got 5 pages of notes from my contact there of all the concerns he has about how the regulation's written. So in the future, owners and operators will have to report their HAP emissions directly to EPA. They will have to report their criteria and precursor pollutants to the state. And then the state will have the option to report HAPs to EPA. The other requirement that this rule changes is a mandatory reporting of any kind of source testing or stack testing. It's not going to make you do more testing, but any testing that you do have to do under current regulations or under current permits will now have to be reported to EPA through this tool. So you'll also be double reporting because there's a SEDRI tool, which some of the federal rules require you to report emissions to SEDRI. So now you'll be reporting it to SEDRI as well as through the combined air emission reporting tool. So for point sources, and point sources are major Title V sources. So right now, as far as changing potential to emit for criteria pollutants, that's not going to change. All this is going to be reporting your actual emissions. It will be requiring any of your HAP emissions for a major source will have to be reported. For non-major sources, if you trigger the reporting under this rule because you have hazardous air pollutants, you're going to have to report those pollutants through the state. Again, some of the emissions, I think I saw some, they're all reported in the rule, it's in tons, but they're very, very small numbers. And when I ran some of the numbers for some common HAPs, some of them were 120 pounds per year, 130 pounds per year. So the thresholds are very low for common pollutants like benzene, formaldehyde, those types of things that you can get from combustion activities. The way the rule is written, it's going to phase in the reporting, and I've got a chart that shows what that phase in, but it's going to start in 2027 for reporting year 2026. Also right now, specifically in Indiana, the way that the state rules are written for requiring reporting is some large, very large sources have to report their emissions annually. Other somewhat large sources only have to report every 3 years, depending on the county that you're located in. And then a lot of sources don't have to report at all. So if you're not a Title V permit facility, you don't have to submit emissions to the state. So for all the companies that have either FESOPs or minor source operating permits or even lower level permits, you may get pulled into reporting even though your permit doesn't specifically tell you you have to do it. That's the other conversation we've had with ITEM is what they'll have to do with their own state rules, whether they will have to go through a SIP revision and make changes to their rule. What's the cost of that going to be for them? And if it's already required federally, do they just drop their rule altogether? So there's a lot going on with how this is going to impact both states and both the regulators and the industry. Some of the other changes, report the geographic coordinates of the release point. To me, this is a really big deal because you're going to have to report the emissions based on the latitude and longitude of where that emission is actually released. And most companies don't necessarily have that. And I know with reporting that we've done and modeling that we've done both in Indiana and in Illinois and other states, the data that is in the state's databases as far as the release points is not very good. There's going to have to be a lot of QA/QC about what are your stack heights, what are your stack velocities, where are they located, and do that kind of mapping of your facility with the GIS lat long. When you're reporting your data, EPA wants you to use your actual stack test data if you have it, which is always typically the best information you're going to have because it's going to be accurate to your facility. If you're not going to use your stack testing data, then you need to tell the state and tell EPA why you're not going to use that. Other data sources that can be used as far as calculating your emissions are EPA has tools such as AP42, WebFire, they have other resources. You can also use site-specific data where you test specifically just to get an emission factor for a process. Again, this change to the rule is going to bring in new sources. So you're going to have to bring in mobile sources into your emission reporting, which typically has not been required in the past. I know if you're doing greenhouse gas reporting like Nick talked about, then a lot of those mobile sources will get counted into the greenhouse gas emissions, but not necessarily for looking at criteria and HAP pollutants from those combustion activities. The rule is going to also require you to include in the report any federal regulations that apply to you. So that, is not too cumbersome. It's just going to tell them basically what federal rules you have to comply with. The other thing, and I know the state commented on this, the fact that the report's going to require you to list your current Title V number. Well, that changes. It can change frequently depending on how often you make changes at your facility. So there's a question about why that's critical to be included. So the HAP emission thresholds, like I said, they vary all over the place depending on the pollutant. They can go from 100 pounds up to 1,000 pounds, or kind of a whole range within the rule. EPA went back to the EPA 2017 air tox screen HAP risk results. So they evaluated that data, and then they looked at these various criteria, and basically they selected the 10th percentile of the various emission levels. And then they would take into effect the cancer risk and the hazard index to determine whether they felt that they needed to lower those emission rates or emission thresholds. So some of the other additions and clarifications that are happening through the rule is there's a couple of different definitions for what's considered a small entity. They're trying to make some provisions to have exceptions or allow allowances for small businesses to potentially not have to do the reporting. One concern is they've got two different definitions of what a small entity is within the rule. And right now they're relying on the Clean Air Act definition, but they also reference the Small Business Association or Small Business Administration definition of what's a small business. So it's going to be curious to see which route they go and what's really considered a small business under the rule. I already talked about the point source provisions as far as you're going to have to report the exact location where those releases are occurring. One of the exceptions for small businesses that they may allow is for you to aggregate your emissions source-wide and just report a facility total instead of individual processes. And they would just have you report that as a fugitive emission across the entire plant. There's more specifics on portable sources, again, the mobile equipment, and also portable sources. The best example I can give for a portable sources would be like a aggregate facility or an asphalt plant that kind of moves around different locations to do different jobs, like all the construction that we're seeing down here. Those are portable plants. They have to be permitted under the air regulations, but the rule's got some specific provisions for those. You can see on the slide see appendix. I've got a supplement to the presentation that's included in the slides that you can access, and that's what's in the appendix. The rulemaking is trying to make some clarifications to the existing rule. There's some specific things for airports and for railroads. There's going to be some exemptions that are added in place, or that's what they're talking about, clarifying who has to actually report, but that's not going to affect you directly. It's going to affect how the states report it to EPA. There's some various codes that they're making some clarifications to as to what the codes apply to as far as NIAX codes and SIC codes. This surprised me. So this rule is going to provide a definition of actual emissions, which I would have assumed the current rule would have already had a definition of actual emissions, but it doesn't. So they add in that definition and they clarify what it actually means. For sources that are not required to have a permit, there is no exemption from this rule to say that you don't have to report even if you don't have a permit. So a very small source that doesn't have a permit or has had a permit, like in Indiana, registration, several years ago, they made it so you didn't have to renew a registration. So you might have a registration that's 15 years old that never accounted for the hazardous air pollutants. Well, if you don't know that you need to go back and do it, and your registration won't tell you that you have to report under this rule. So there's going to be some challenges to people to understand when and how often they have to report. And again, you won't be required to get a report or to get a permit if you have to do the report. You'll still be able to operate at whatever threshold. If you're exempt, you can still operate without a permit. So this is the phase-in. So for states, the inventory years starting 2022 and through 2024, that's going to be looked at. So they'll have to start reporting in 2025. For owners and operators, it will actually be, for all facilities, they'll have to report 5 months into 2027 for 2026. And then 2030 beyond, it'll be 3 months after the end of the year. So again, they looked at this as an advantage that you can start doing your reporting early in the year for TRI, which is something that's due July 1st. Okay, so for small generating units, if you've got any kind of boiler or turbine that's going to produce electricity, either for the grid, then you're going to have to do additional reporting for those small units. And then the rule does have several alternatives within the report, and that's why it's important for people to review the rule and provide comments, since they are opting for giving you some options. So they've got the preferred alternative is for the state to report the data for small generating units when they're not directly reported due to offset and demand. If it's not reported by the state, then the owner or operator is going to be required to submit the report and provide that data. The information you're going to provide is pretty simple. I mean, it's going to be the date that it was used, the fuel that was used, and the heat input by the generator or turbine that you're using. The first alternative is to actually expand the preferred alternative to gather data for all units, not just those that are at point sources. So again, point sources are the major sources. So this would be for all units. The second alternative, D3, is actually a scaled back version, and it's going to be more for non-attainment areas. And then the fourth, I guess, alternative is a one-time collection option where EPA will collect the data directly from the curtailment service providers. I talked about this already, about the confidential data. And so right now, the current regulation has a definition of what's considered confidential. There has been some confusion and some question and conflict with states on to what this really means. So they're clarifying the definition, and it's going to be that anything that's reported within this rule is not going to be confidential. So you'll be including specifics as far as what capacity units you have on site, exactly what units you have on site, exactly where they're located within your facility. So I think they may get some pushback on that a little bit because a lot of states will allow some of that information to be confidential. Okay, so the HAP emissions. So right now there's no requirement in the rule to report your HAP emissions. And what's changing is if the facility is a Title V source, then they're going to have to complete their facility inventory. They're going to have to include all of their HAPs. If there's incidental criteria or precursor pollutants that are associated, then they'll have to report that as well. So an example of that would be like if you have emissions for benzene that are above the thresholds, then you would have to report the benzene emissions, but you would also have to report the VOC emissions. You're going to report using the Combined Air Emissions Reporting System, and that'll start in 2027. The information I've had in discussions with EPA and the state is that this system has a lot of bugs. They're expecting in the proposed rule, they talk about the amount of time that they expect for companies to have to spend, and they expect small businesses to spend up to 27 hours to do their initial report, and some of the costs that they're looking at it, and what Indiana is looking at is it could cost states, or cost companies $30,000 to do a single report. So there's a lot of implications, especially with the first year to build the whole inventory and build it into their system. There is an alternative to this, and it's talking about also requiring PFAS, which that's going to be a whole nightmare in its own. And I don't know that they've defined the list of PFAS yet within the rule. There are provisions in the rule to reduce the burden on small facilities, but right now they're looking at about 35 to 40,000 facilities that, nationwide that could be impacted by this. Again, the item is telling me they think it could be 1,300 or 1,400 sources that don't currently have to report, may have to start reporting. Again, for small facilities, they may be able to report facility-wide their total emissions rather than at the point source and at the data level. So EPA still could remove this option depending on what their annual modeling results show. One of the groups of companies, so a lot of this is based on your NIAX code. So for small entities like hospitals can get pulled in, collision shops can get pulled in, and some of those were exempted if they're an independent, like auto repair place. But if it's a chain, then all of those may have to report. So I know ITEM is looking at that because they said that 90% of the small repair businesses in Indiana are owned by basically 3 companies. So all of those may get pulled into the rule. Again, they're going to have to use the electronic reporting system, and all your data will have to be uploaded into that system. So your initial report's going to be a challenge to get all of the data into the system, depending on how easy it is to use. I've got a question into item about whether the data that they're reporting, if any of that data will be able to be downloaded for individual facilities to use. You're going to have to report your performance tests, and that data is going to all be going into the state, or to EPA, and that'll be public information. Again, I mentioned when those tests are required to be reported, they're going into the SEDRI. Now they're talking about possibly also having to report it into this system. And I've got questions about whether those two systems will communicate with each other. Right now, it's not clear that they will. So as far as talking about calculating the emissions using your stack test data, again, that's going to be your best data to use to calculate your actual emissions for your site if you have that data. And again, they are thinking that this combined air emission reporting tool is going to help people with their reporting because it'll be more specific about where your emission releases are. It will help you be able to have another database to go get that information. So let's say you don't know your emissions data. You can go and look for another facility that's similar to yours based on your SIC code or your NIAX code and go pull their data and use that as a reference point potentially. So there is an option within the rule that's going to allow for, if EPA approves it, for the state to report on behalf of the regulated entity or the industry that's got to report. I don't know that IDEM would choose to take that option on. It just would be another burden for them to do that. And again, that's going to be for your CAPs and your HAPs. So in that case, you would report your information to the state. The state would then turn around and report it to EPA. But again, the rule also says that one option is for you to report directly to EPA. So you may be doing dual reporting, once to the state and once to EPA. Again, there are various options within the state reporting, and so we're going to have to just watch the comments on the rule and see, what the final rule comes out to be. So this is the type of information that will end up being put into either to the state or to CARES. So your facility attributes, which is your address, your location, type of facility that you are, your annual emissions. So those will both be going right now. The way the rule's written is you'll be reporting to both the state and through CARES. And then your source tests will be going through SEDRI, but will also be going to CARES. So it can get to be a fairly burdensome requirement. So here are some different links for comments and questions on the proposed rule. Comments, again, can be submitted through October 18th. Like I said, IDEM may comment on the rule, and I know there are several industry groups that are likely going to be commenting on the rule as well.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah.
Thank you.